The elevator doors opened with a whisper, revealing a hallway that smelled of lavender and steel. It was early, the kind of early that silenced everything but distant footsteps and motion sensors blinking awake. The city outside had just begun its breathing. Taxis blinking through intersections, delivery trucks aligning at curbs, and the fog of breath curling from mouths not yet ready to speak. He stepped into the corridor slowly, his boots muffled by the pristine carpet that ran like a strip of entitlement down the center of the space. Every wall gleamed with minimalist art, but he didn't glance at it. He had seen it 100 times before, not in frames, but in meetings where form mattered more than function. He passed reception without a nod. The desk was empty. The security camera caught his shape in passing. A man too casually dressed for this floor, too quiet for a client, too early for staff. He entered the boardroom without permission. No one stopped him. Not yet. He took a seat near the end of the 12-foot glass table, the one without a nameplate. There were no nameplates at this hour. No espresso carts, no assistants rehearsing pleasantries. Just silence and opportunity. He unzipped his jacket, folded it once across the back of the chair, and laid a single sheet of paper in front of him. The numbers were neat, tight, projected growth rates in clean columns. A handwritten circle around 187%. That was what today was about. That was why he was here. Not because he needed capital, but because they needed his. And none of them knew yet that the decision had already been made. Not with a handshake or a signature, but with months of silent watching, quiet inquiries, and data that didn't lie. He heard them before he saw them. The clatter of heels, the murmur of voices, the tonal shift of the building waking to wealth. He didn't rise. He didn't need to. They entered in groups. Consultants in curated suits, executives balancing poise with hunger, and founders too young to remember what failure smelled like. They took their seats with precision. Rehearsed laughs, shining teeth. Someone glanced at him. Twice. Brows knit just enough to register confusion. And then, without words, came the silent verdict. He wasn't supposed to be here. The meeting began. PowerPoint slides bloomed across the wall like declarations. Flowcharts, KPIs, market potential. He watched, listened, measured. They spoke of inclusive design with no brown faces on their charts. They spoke of accessibility, but cited no user experience data from neighborhoods he once called home. They projected returns on industries they had never walked through. He knew what he was watching. Not innovation, extraction. They were polished, but not prepared. At the end, the presenter mentioned new investor rounds. A list of strategic capital partners. His name was not among them, because no one had dared to ask who was in the room. Not really. And as they broke for lunch and white plates were arranged on linen cloth, he moved through the crowd unnoticed, as though he were waiting for someone else. That's when the seat opened. Front row, closest to the CEO. He took it without hesitation, crossed one leg, laid the folder in his lap. That's when the man approached. Tan skin, tailored blazer, eyes rehearsed for dismissal. "Sir, this seat is for real clients." He said it smoothly, the way you'd say it to a coat rack, to someone whose presence made your narrative harder to sell. The man gestured toward the back wall. A nod, firm but polite, like offering directions to a stranger who'd wandered into the wrong hotel lobby. The investor stood. No resistance, no speech. He folded his folder quietly, left the seat, and walked to the rear without looking back. But inside, something shifted. A switch. Not anger, not pride, but calculation. Not of worth, of clarity. Because in 30 minutes they would all learn. And this room that built castles out of assumptions would have to sit in the ruins of its own blindness. The back wall of the conference hall was a soft blur of shadows and half-heard conversations. Waiters in black button-downs moved like murmurs, pouring coffee, resetting napkins. From his vantage point, the investor could see the entire room without being seen. He preferred it that way. The lights were dimmed slightly now, not for atmosphere, but because the pitch session was beginning. A fresh rotation of founders stepped up to the screen with bright slides and brighter promises. Each wore the same smile, carefully curated confidence designed to conceal the rust behind the polish. He flipped open his folder. Not theirs, his. Inside were pages he didn't print for effect. No branding, no logos, no mission statements. Just numbers. Silent witnesses. For quarters worth of operating losses masked as user acquisition. A marketing spend that outpaced retention. Leadership structures bloated by self-promotion and hollow titles. One of the presenters bragged of international expansion. He had the customs records proving their overseas shipping hadn't even cleared once. He knew because he'd already done his due diligence on all of them. Silently. Long before the event. While they chased headlines, he traced balance sheets. They were hunting for visionaries. He was auditing illusions. A woman near him, early 30s, all black everything, crisp scent of cardamom, turned toward him between presenters. Are you with one of the startups? He shook his head once. Press. He shook it again. She smiled politely, leaned away. Another assumption sealed with a glance. He returned to the stage. The next speaker was animated. A tech founder from Silicon Valley, voice laced with TED Talk rhythm, pitching an app that supposedly redefined financial freedom. He claimed the app was already used by 200,000 people. The investor's data said otherwise. Downloads, yes, but only 4.7% active users. Negative churn. Trustpilot flooded with unresolved complaints. Yet the crowd nodded along, because belief is louder than truth until truth takes the mic. He looked toward the front row, the one he'd been asked to leave. The man from earlier sat beside the CEO, still glancing at his Rolex every 5 minutes, still measuring time as if it owed him something. He didn't even remember the face he'd dismissed. Why would he? They never did. The investor didn't mind. He wasn't there for recognition. He was there for recalibration. The final pitch ended in applause. Mild, obligatory. The event organizer returned to the podium, smiling wide with practiced charm. And now, she said, voice rising, we are honored to introduce someone who made this gathering possible. A partner who believed in us before we even knew how to spell Series A. The room shifted. Some sat straighter. Others looked down at their programs, searching for a name. She continued. He's been with us quietly, strategically, and generously. And though he's never asked for the spotlight, we think it's time we gave it to him. The lights swiveled. The investor blinked slowly. The organizer smiled toward the back. Please welcome our lead financial architect and cornerstone investor, Mr. Elijah Marin. The name struck like a tuning fork. Stillness. Then turning. One row, then two, then all of them, turning to face the man they hadn't seen, the one they'd brushed past or redirected or moved aside. The man in the denim jacket. Boots on clean carpet. Unmoved. Unbothered. He stood slowly. Not out of pride, but out of clarity. And as he walked the aisle, forward, not back, those who had once tried to measure his worth in wardrobe or seating arrangement now watched in silence. Because the only real seat in the room was the one that couldn't be taken from him. The applause was polite. Too polite. It didn't know what to be: congratulatory, apologetic, or uncertain. Some clapped because others clapped. Others clapped to cover the sudden silence of their assumptions collapsing. Elijah stepped onto the stage, not with bravado, not with anger, but with the stillness of someone who had long since stopped needing permission. The lights above caught the grain of his jacket. His boots echoed once on the polished floor before finding rest. He took no mic. He didn't need one. His presence was enough. The host motioned for him to say something. He declined with a single glance. Not dismissive. Just deliberate. Then, without a word, he turned away from the podium and faced the audience directly. They didn't know what to do. He looked across them, not at them, but through them. The VCs who only invested in reflections of themselves. The founders who spoke of impact while designing exclusion. The consultants who preached diversity with decks empty of action. He said nothing. And somehow that said everything. Then he stepped down. No speech. No flex. Just a man walking back to where he never should have been asked to leave in the first place. He didn't return to the back wall. He didn't sit in the real client row either. He walked out. Out of the hall. Down the marble corridor. Past the velvet ropes. Through the automatic glass doors. And into the real world. Because he'd already decided what to do. Not fund louder people. Build quieter power. Back in the tower, chaos unfolded with velvet gloves. The CEO asked who approved the seating list. Someone whispered about investor relations. Someone else asked who knew Elijah's face, why it hadn't been circulated. The man with the gold watch stayed silent. He didn't know how to apologize for something he hadn't realized he'd done. Because to him, Elijah had never even been part of the story. But outside the building, the real story was just beginning. Elijah walked to a nearby cafe, small, independently owned, hardwood tables worn soft by conversation. He ordered tea, sat by the window, and opened a laptop older than most of the room's interns. He typed for hours. Not emails. Blueprints. For a fund. Not one that demanded headlines, but one that would shift tides. It had no website, no deck, no launch party, only intentions. And capital. He didn't seek startups with high burn rates and glossy brochures. He sought out founders who never made it past the lobby. The ones building in silence with savings from night shifts and code written between raising children. He visited workshops in Queens, studios in Oakland, co-ops in Atlanta. Not asking them to pitch, but asking them what they needed. And then he wrote checks. No cameras. No tweets. Just wiring amounts most had never seen to ideas that should have never needed validation. In 6 months, his fund backed 9 companies. 8 of them led by Black founders. 5 of them by women. None had ever been called real clients. Until now. And one evening, in a city across the country, a young founder launched an app that helped tenants document illegal evictions. At the launch event, when asked how they funded it, the founder just smiled and said, "A man gave me a seat at a table I didn't know I was allowed to approach." The crowd clapped. They didn't know his name. But Elijah didn't mind. Because in every startup he seeded, every business he believed in, he wasn't looking to be seated in the front row. He was building tables that didn't need rows at all. A year passed. Not loud, not fast, just steady like tidewater reshaping the edge of stone. In that year, the conference was held again. Same venue. Same structure. The carpet changed. The branding updated. But the assumptions? They hadn't moved an inch. The same coordinator sent a renewed invitation. Elijah didn't reply. Not because he was offended, but because he no longer needed to prove his presence in their rooms. He had built his own. Elsewhere in the city, the old post office was being converted. Red brick scarred by time. Layers of old flyers still clinging to the facade like memories that wouldn't be scrubbed away. It had been listed for years, too far from the tech corridor, too close to the wrong zip code, they said. Elijah bought it. Not with noise. With wire transfers and signed deeds. No one noticed. Until construction began. It wasn't a startup incubator. It wasn't a co-working space. It was something harder to define. Because it wasn't trying to impress anyone. It was for the people who'd stopped trying to be seen and instead started building in the dark. The lobby was wide, unpolished, filled with light. No security desk. No badges. No clearance tiers. Just rooms. Open ones. For creators. Engineers. Writers. Mothers. Ex-cons. Immigrants. No one asked what school you went to, only what you were trying to create, and whether you needed quiet, Wi-Fi, or childcare while doing it. They called it the table. No website, no press, just stories. One girl, 13 years old, prototyped a speech-generating device for her nonverbal brother. A former bus driver mapped a supply chain app for Black farmers. A single father reverse-engineered delivery tracking software because his local service wouldn't deliver to his neighborhood. And behind it all, silently reviewing blueprints, fielding grant requests, and pushing funds forward? Elijah. He sat in a small back room. No sign on the door. A desk scattered with paper. Same denim jacket. Same boots. People came not to pitch but to talk. He listened. Sometimes gave. Sometimes didn't. But he always explained why. No one left confused. No one left smaller than they arrived. And still no press came. Because he didn't send invites. But the echo grew. One founder mentioned him in an op-ed. Another thanked him during a podcast. And soon others, used to being gatekeepers, began noticing shifts. Why were so many high-performing startups not attending their pitch events? Why were legacy investors being outbid by silent capital? Why did their analytics show Black-led teams outperforming projections 5 quarters straight? And finally, why had their new portfolio leads started referencing a name? Not from Stanford, not from Forbes, but from the streets most of them couldn't pronounce without flinching? They tried to call him. His assistant said he was busy. They offered meetings. He declined. They sent invites. He archived them because he no longer needed to reclaim seats. He was funding architects who didn't need invitations. And one day, a consultant who once sat front row at the conference walked past a billboard under the expressway. It read, "Don't fight for a seat. Build the floor." He froze. Under it, no branding. Just a faint tag. #the table. The consultant took a photo. Posted it. Captioned, "I think I was in the wrong room all along." It started with a glitch. An online scheduling portal failed to recognize a neighborhood's zip code. Founders from that area, many of whom had recently gained traction, couldn't sign up for the regional pitch summit. Emails went unanswered. Calls redirected to bots. No explanations, just error messages. Among them was a team of 4. 2 sisters, a mechanic, and a deaf coder. They'd built a mobile app for emergency car diagnostics, specifically for low-income neighborhoods often ignored by big-name roadside assistants. Their user base was growing fast. Their retention rate was over 70%. They had more data than anyone in the room they couldn't enter. But none of it mattered. They weren't on the list. They didn't panic. They walked to the table. Elijah was already there, looking at a map of Wi-Fi dead zones across 5 states. He didn't ask for their slide deck. He asked who they built it for. When they told him, he wrote one number on a post-it and passed it across the table. It was more than they'd asked for. Less than he could have given. But enough. That same month, a major pitch competition went viral for the wrong reasons. A finalist, white, young, wealthy, with a product described as Uber for yachts, received $6 million in funding live on stage. Meanwhile, 5 other finalists, all from marginalized communities, received applause and nothing else. Clip hit Twitter. A side-by-side, yacht app, $6 million. Community water filter, $0. Outrage flared. Think pieces rolled in. Public apologies issued. But Elijah didn't comment. He just forwarded more grants. One to a bakery run by refugee mothers digitizing traditional recipes. Another to a teen-led project that built solar lanterns from e-waste. And one to a former janitor who had mapped every elevator shaft in buildings across the city and designed an app to help disabled users avoid breakdowns in real time. The old world watched in confusion. Who was this man? Why wasn't he interested in returns? But they were wrong. Elijah was interested in returns. Just not the kind they measured. He tracked how many jobs were created. How many single parents reduced hours because their startup turned profitable. How many teams added mental health days to their internal calendars without needing permission. One evening, in a quiet back room of the table, Elijah reviewed quarterly reports written in marker, typed in Google Docs, scribbled in notebooks. They weren't polished, but they were real. Across town, a gala was taking place, crystal lights, gold sponsor badges, exclusive lists. Someone there stood at a podium, giving a speech on the future of innovation. He said, "Access is the new equity." The room clapped, but Elijah had already stopped listening to speeches like that. He was watching a live stream on a cracked tablet. One of his founders, an autistic woman from East Cleveland, was demoing her accessibility AI at a community center. There were no suits in the audience, just children, parents, old teachers. But when she finished, the room stood, and Elijah smiled, because real applause doesn't need chandeliers. The morning was overcast. The sky hovered low, indifferent. Rain hadn't yet come, but the air warned it would. Elijah walked without an umbrella. He always did. He moved through the streets slowly, as if seeing them again for the first time. The same streets that once asked him to move aside, that once closed their doors before his shadow touched the threshold. The difference now wasn't the street. It was the weight he carried, not on his back but behind him. Dozens of founders, hundreds of employees, thousands of customers impacted by startups that never needed to code switch, shrink, or soften to be deemed legitimate. Every one of them tied to a name he never needed to say out loud. Elijah Marin. But the name didn't matter anymore. The work spoke louder. He arrived at a university he hadn't attended. He was scheduled to speak, not because he'd asked, but because a student-led group had invited him. No faculty, no board, just a collective of undergrads who'd heard about the table and wanted to learn how to build their own. He accepted only under one condition. No stage, no introductions, no photos. They agreed. So he stood in a small room, surrounded by mismatched chairs, scribbled notebooks, and faces that looked like neighborhoods usually left out of innovation conferences. He didn't lecture. He asked questions. What do you need? What are you building? What would you do if no one told you no? And when it ended, they didn't clap. They didn't need to. They understood. Later that week, a prominent investor, one of the same who had once waved him away from a seat, approached him at a private industry dinner. The man smiled too wide, extended a hand. Didn't realize you were that Elijah. Elijah didn't shake it. He nodded once, politely, then returned to his plate. Because time had taught him that validation from old rooms was no longer necessary. The rooms he built, they were louder, stronger, more honest. He received updates weekly. A farm cooperative in Mississippi had shipped their 100,000th crate. A young girl in Chicago had patented her wearable glucose monitor. A prison reform nonprofit had doubled its outreach because of an algorithm written by a man who taught himself to code while sweeping floors. No one mentioned Elijah in the headlines, but those whose lives were changed didn't need a byline to remember him. Years passed. The building that once rejected him was sold, remodeled, turned into condos. No plaques remained. No memory of where he once stood. But a new building stood across the river. Sleek but warm. Built of recycled material. Solar-powered. Designed for accessibility. Named only one word. Access. Inside, under the first beam, carved so faintly that you had to step close to see it, were 5 words. This seat is for everyone. No investor logos. No signatures. No ego. Just the principle Elijah had lived for. The belief that legacy isn't about being seen. It's about who gets to stand because you refused to sit when told you didn't belong. He sat near the entrance sometimes, still in denim, still quiet, and when people walked in, he never asked what school they went to. He asked, "What are you building?" Then he moved aside and made space.